Hey everyone, Georgie here with Ukraine Matters. Autumn weather is approaching Ukraine very fast, which will bring cold, rain, and a lot of mud, which will definitely impact how well Russia can conduct its offensive operation, and maybe will give some respite to the Ukrainian armed forces in their defensive operations. Moreover, right now, Russians are so focused on attacking all across the front line that many experts are raising important questions whether or not Russia really has the forces to continue attacking. Are there signs to show that they're slowing down, or this is just a small operational pause to recoup their forces? Let's jump in. We have many topics to cover, and we're going to start with the craziest part of the front line, where Russians, after many days spent on the aggregate facility in Vovchansk, where Ukrainians use that Russians are holding that facility to cut them away from the supply chain of the Russian forces, to then be able to clear out that facility on the northern side of Vovchansk, which is located right over here. It's still colored blue. After which Russians just instantly decided, no, that's not good enough that Ukrainians have recaptured this position. Let's restrike again and recapture that part again, essentially ending up in exactly the same situation where they were before, with a lot of troops captured on this aggregate facility. It's so hilarious beyond belief, because there were already many attempts of recapturing these positions where were quite gruesome footage shown from that. Again, all of the videos about this will be in Discord, and we'll try to find this footage and list them in a video share channel so you can easily see what I'm talking about here. But there was this gruesome footage from the attempts at striking this facility, where Russians lost almost 100 men trying to just get in. And the reports are that some individuals were able to actually get into this facility. The problem is the fact that they got in doesn't mean that the situation suddenly improved. That it doesn't mean that they suddenly pushed the Ukrainians out. Quite on the contrary, Russians are reporting that Ukrainians are tightening up their positions around the north of Kharkiv. And this is making it more ridiculous. So the current running theory is, and this actually is true for a lot of the front line, that the commanders that looked at the situation all across the front line, looked at the situation that Ukraine has found themselves in, with not being able to fully defend all of the parts of the front line and having problems around the Pokrovsk area, and either they smelled the blood in the air, or, which is much more relevant for the Russian commanders, some recognition medals or some monetary regalia that they can get, stuff like that. And they are actually pushing their troops to do things despite the losses incurred. And this is exactly how this aggregate plant is being reported. Ukrainians were able to recapture that position, worsening the situation, but because it's not a good optics for the commander of this northern area of Kharkiv, and let's just say his achievements were very much minimal in this area, we know that much. But after losing that position, apparently it triggered something in a command chain, and he instantly ordered his troops to then, no, do whatever you must and just go and recapture that aggregate facility. So right now there has been incredible losses that Russians incurred on trying to recapture that position, and this is also happening on other parts of the front line. Same is also true in the Kursk area. Here Russians were having some limited success at the time, where Ukrainians undercut their advances by trying to attack from the unexpected side. From there, Russians were kind of like, okay, we cannot really deal with everything at once with the forces that we have in this area. So they stopped along, and they're complaining a lot that despite everything, they're not having, despite having an advantage in force, they're not still having the supplies that they need. This is addition is supplemented by the Ukrainians taking out the storage facilities that are covered just recently with the big explosions, exploding a lot of ammunition that was supposed to come into this area and supplement the advances of the Russian forces in this area. I'll remind you that Ukrainian forces in Kursk are more than 3-1 disadvantage towards the Russians. Some are saying that there is even more Russians that have been poured in, mostly from the newly recruited through the Russian conscription service program to help supplement this offensive. So there is quite a lot of Russian forces in the area, but they're having major troubles trying to kick out the Ukrainians from the Kursk region. Then there is the pain point, which is this Pishena axis, where Ukrainians are having some trouble containing it. And so far, the reports is that Ukrainians here are fully on defensive. Russians were able to advance a little bit more this week in the Pishana direction. And I think it's would be honest to say that most likely the eastern part of this river, the Oskil River that goes right over here, it will be split into two areas where the bigger area towards Borova and towards Liman will be one part, and then the northern part around the Kupiansk-Vizlovy will be the second one. It's problematic, but it's not super critical. There is always the possibilities to set up pontoon bridges. There's always possibilities to cross other places. So while it's not the best, it's something that Ukrainians, I feel, are okay-ish with. Obviously, if we want the situation to be developing into Ukrainians' favor, then we would not want to see anything like this happen. But the situation is as the situation is. Chasiv Yar is continuing being the stronghold. Here, the situation that I described is exactly what I told you. Chasiv Yar holds because it's unpenetrable fortress. If you can see, it has a lot of lakes. It has a lot of these uneven topography in Chasiv Yar. It's very hard for Russians to attack. It's well defended. Moreover, Ukrainians are still holding the key positions to the south of the city, which prevents Russians from going around Chasiv Yar from the southern side, and Ukrainians are holding strong in these hill positions, which are critical. The names of the settlements in this area are less relevant. It's more of a reference point. More important here are the high grounds that are located around here, which are controlled by Ukraine and are able to defend against Russian continuous attacks. Toretsk is a major defensive positions for Ukrainians. Russians were able to enter the city, and right now there is fighting towards the center of the city. So Russians were not able to go around the city, but they were able to enter the city right straight forward, and they're now fighting inside of the center of the city. It is not something that attacking force would do, so if of all of the possibilities of how Toretsk could potentially fall, I mean, the word favorable is not really that good because nothing is favorable from losing a position, but you get what I'm saying, that in all of the ways to kind of fight for Toretsk, Russians trying to attack in a narrow line towards the center of the city, getting into the urban warfare, is probably the most acceptable for the Ukrainian armed forces. So whilst there is fighting inside Toretsk and the advances are there, because it's an urban fight and because it is not an encircled city, it's gonna take a while for Russians to take it. So I would not expect Toretsk to fall before the end of the year. I feel that we will see the fighting for Toretsk ongoing still into 2025. New York, here Russians were trying to push back on the Ukrainian recaptured position at the north of the city. Right now it's a back and forth between the two, so this position right now, I'm going to call it a stable. Pokrovsk area. So Pokrovsk is a very difficult area to report, and we're going to touch about it a little bit more right after I cover the rest of the front line. But in general, situation has been slowly, I don't want to say improving because it would be an understatement on how difficult it is, but Ukrainians were able to slow down Russians. Russian attacks are narrowing and narrowing and narrowing and narrowing. So right now, for example, the whole last 2 weeks, they were very, very much focused on capturing these areas over here, especially Tsukurne. I mean, it's an important settlement because it allows both to threaten the pocket right over here, this pocket, but it also threatens the Selidova, which is like a last major hurdle of Russians before they can move towards Pokrovsk directly. And Tsukurne, it's an important settlement, but it's been fought for 2 weeks, which is a lot slower than what was the tempo of Russians before. And it is together with relatively limited advances Russians of all the other front line. Yes, there was supposedly reports that Russians are in control of Grodivka village. Yes, there are supposedly reports that Russians right now are in control of Nikolaevka village, which is right next to the outskirts of Pokrovsk. But still, the advances are slower and the scale is definitely narrowing down. So a lot of analysts and experts are stating that it's a bit early to say whether Russia is running out of steam, because we don't know about the will and desire of Russians to push forward, but it is a first sign of potentially something changing on the front line. Vuhledar, unfortunately, has fallen. We talked about this significantly. Fall of Vuhledar is bad, but it's actually less critical than it was a year before. Now, a year before, the situation was that Vuhledar was extremely important, as there was like a railway line that was going right over here. It was actually going through Volnovakha, sorry, it's a little bit to the south. And as Ukrainians were able to control Vuhledar, they were able to prevent the reinforcements and logistics of Russians by the use of this railway line. However, while Ukrainians were holding Vuhledar, Russians are actually invested and they build a secondary railway line which goes around the southern edge of this area of Ukraine. And right now this rail line is operational, so it's less critical that Vuhledar right now is not being held. Now, I know that I'm trying to kind of put a good picture here on a bad face, because obviously losing Vuhledar is not nice, but generally speaking, it's lost a little bit of its criticality, and now we're coming into the defense around the general Pokrovsk area. There are two main points that Ukraine wants to defend, is Kurakhove and Pokrovsk Mirnograd. That's the two big points that are Ukrainian interest in the area. If Kurakhove falls, that literally would mean probably that this whole area would be taking over. Additional things to note is that there are some reports of Russian being active around the Robotyne area and even moving somewhere around Kamensk, but it's all local operations, very, very small units, like up to groups of 10. So right now I'm monitoring this, but there is nothing major to report for now. Couple of notes to everything that I said. First things first, that around the Kharkiv area, which we were talking around the Kupiansk, where there is a split in two, towards the area of Kupiansk, from this area, they were trying to go for this point. Ukrainians have been reporting that they've actually thwarted the Russian operations, and they were able to stop over the 50 armored units advancing towards Kupiansk. There is a video for that, and again, you can easily find the video on the Discord channel. Moreover, Officer Plus, a current fighter for the Ukrainian Armed Forces, is reporting the change in what they are meeting on the front line. Instead of a lot of experienced units that were fighting for the Russian forces, they are meeting more and more freshly recruited forces being thrown straight towards the front line. And this is again another sign that potentially is suggesting that Russian reserves are running dry, that whatever they had trained before have now been expended and need some recouping. And right now, as Russia is getting new recruits, they're just instantly being sent to the front line. It's a very dangerous game they're playing, and if Ukraine does indeed has these 14 brigades that Zelensky was talking about, then it can be a potentially devastating counterpunch. But we don't know. I am not saying anything, but I have my doubts about how well Russia is doing. Moreover, Clement Molin here, he's a great OSINT analyst, and has been studying a lot about what Ukraine is doing with regards to defenses. And we know that Ukraine has had significant problems on the Pokrovsk area. One was the organizational problems within the Ukrainian military. Now, I'm not covering that a lot, mostly because we're not really influenced by that, right? It's something that Ukrainians need to discuss for themselves on how to improve their operations in the military, because the way that we're running before the military cannot be run anyway. Ukrainian army from 2 years ago doesn't exist anymore. Right now, Ukrainian army is a lot bigger, and there's a lot more people that were not fully professionally bred for war. It's a lot of mobilized people that are also part of that military. So there is a lot of this unskilled, untrained personnel that is rotating here and out. And because all of the training deadlines need to be tightened up, there is a lot of deeper competencies that are missing within the military personnel. That's why the mistakes happen. And one of the major things that people dismiss a lot is saying, oh my God, there's so many errors and mistakes in the Ukrainian command, whereas like Russians are continuing advancing. Well, this all comes down to resources. Like resources, if you have the resource advantage, you can allow yourself to do more mistakes than your enemy. So Ukraine being an underdog in the resource, they cannot just plug in mistakes of command, mistakes of staff by just throwing in more ammunition or firepower at it. That's unfortunately not happening. So it's a huge problem to solve, and I'm really happy that some of this is happening. But beyond that, big issue was the fortifications around this area. Now, there were fortifications, but supposedly they were not built as correctly as it wished for, and there was problems with supplementing it with manpower. I already talked about the organization and manpower that is being discussed. Here we can see he talks about the new fortifications that are being built around Pokrovsk area, specifically preparing for the Russian advances towards Pokrovsk. And in this picture, I laughed a little bit because there was a lot of the pro-Ukrainian side critiquing Syrskyi for micromanaging the forces on the front lines. I looked at this picture briefly, and it seems that Syrskyi is micromanaging digging of the trenches as well. But beyond that, the trenches are extensive, the network is good, and it seems that the fortification lines are being built quite intensely over the areas. The fortification quality has been improving, and it's very good to see that the number of these smaller fortification and firing positions are being adequately prepared for the Russian potential advances, so prepare to defend in depth. It's not going to be an easy walk for the Russians going deeper into Ukraine, so nothing is ending here. I will leave the link to this thread in a description on the first comment of the video. I recommend you checking it out. Then talking about the weather, we will see the first couple of autumn rains hitting Ukraine around the Sunday, Monday, the next week, so next weekend. And we will see that the temperature will start dropping from the current 25-20 degrees Celsius to more 12-13 degrees, which is a lot colder. It is still not going to be super cold and wet, but it's definitely a first wind of change that is coming for the autumn. Institute for Study of War made really good assessment by looking at some of the OSINT analysts that are counting what are the Russian losses in the area. And what's interesting, Dave noted the Russian losses around the Pokrovsk area, which is the axis of the main attack line of Russia, where they were able to move from Avdiivka to Novokhodivka, and this is the area where Russians have been attacking. So in this area of attack, to capture this much, they were actually forced to lose a lot of resources. Most notably, they've counted the equipment here, and they said that Russian forces have lost 1,830 pieces of heavy equipment from October 9, 2023 to basically the end of September of 2024. It's over 539 tanks, and it's important here to underscore it's visually confirmed. It's only the visually confirmed Russian losses. There is still certain level of losses of Russians that are not being counted here. So when I'm telling you that Russian losses are stupendously high, when I'm telling you that Russian losses are completely unsustainable, that is what I'm talking about. These types of losses, just to go on the Pokrovsk direction and try to capture this area of Pokrovsk. And we need to state very important thing here. While obviously the loss of Avdiivka is bad, while the fact that Russians are moving towards Pokrovsk is bad, but A, getting to Pokrovsk is not the same as capturing Pokrovsk, and B, to be honest, the expectations were that Russia will be able to achieve more. After we were talking about that the Russian budget has been increasing significantly, their gains are not reflective of that increase of the budget. Now, they obviously are able to advance somewhere on the front line, but that advance is not coming easier. That advance is not suddenly coming like Russia has newfound ability to break into the operational, into larger theater of operation, where they're changing and capturing major city after major city after major city. No, remember I told you about Pokrovsk, Mirnograd, and Kurakhivka? Well, they were still at the start of the year the two main points for the Russians to capture. The goal of the plan, most likely what Russians were expecting, is they would be able to reach Pokrovsk and maybe semi-encircle it. That would be the ultimate goal. They would completely cut out this line over here, completely capturing Kurakhova. And they also hoped that after Bakhmut, they would capture Chasiv Yar, Toretsk, and cut out this area. That was basically the adequate goal that what Russia was hoping to achieve with such a level of increase of their yearly dedication to the military. And we talked about this in yesterday's video, and people noticed like, well, Georgie, this is a yearly increase of the military spending, so 25.7% is actually more than 67 because it's built on the previous year. I know that. That's not the point. The idea is that every second year, if Russia wants to expand the scale of their operations, because again, if we look at this map, this is the gains of Russians from the start of the war, from the February 2022 at the top, all the way to the bottom, to the September of 24, you will see that all of the numbers here that are essentially saying 24, that's 2024. So with all of that major increase in their increase to pay the supplemental efforts to the factories, releasing new weapons and ammunition, from them pulling from their storages and activating all of their resources, hiring new staff, increasing the number of the active personnel, increasing how much that personnel is getting paid, all of that increase. And they still are very lackluster in what they're achieving. As you can see, you can barely see that nothing changed in the territory controlled by the Russians. But the point is that they needed not 25.7%. If they really wanted to change how this war goes, they needed like 125%. Maybe I'm a little bit pushing, but you get my point. The 25.7%, when adjusted especially for inflation, which is now like unofficial inflation is about 20+% for Russians. If you think like, okay, if with an inflation of prices of like 20%, if you don't want my numbers, okay, let's take Russian official inflation numbers of 9%. So 25 minus 9 is like what, 16%, 17%? Okay, 17% increase to their ability to wage warfare and more production and more investment in the military. It is nothing. It's nothing that will impact the Russian ability to wage warfare. And again, the cheap ability to increase their military output, their military performance is out. They already are pulling everything from the stockpiles. Their existing factories are already working 3 shifts. Russia is peaking at their capabilities at waging war, and the results are lackluster. That is what I'm stating, and that is what this graph is showing. Not that the total amount is bigger or changes and so on. That's not the point. Then a couple of shout outs at the end. First shout out to Gary Kasparov, which actually is doing what I said that the Russian opposition needs to be doing. And Gary has been probably one of the few Russians, though I'm not sure if we can even call Russia, because Russians themselves don't really like Gary, and he has very little impact on the Russians themselves. He has like a super small scale, but he's doing the right thing at least. He's doing what every Russian oppositioner should be doing, is standing behind the Free Russia Legion and saying, we're going to start gathering the money for the Russians fighting on the side of Ukraine. I don't know why this need to be done just 2.5 years after the Russian invasion into Ukraine, but at least we are there finally. Better late than never, I guess. And then the final shout out to the NAFO 69 Sniffing Brigade. Just want to let everyone know here that we're working on hitting off the new campaign very, very soon with the NAFO 69 Sniffing Brigade. We're going to get the help to Ukrainian armed forces. We're going to do what we can because we care. I love you. Slava Ukraini, trust in Ukrainian armed forces, and I see you next time.